Thank you. Thank you to Carroll Community College and the library for hosting this event. I've been a professor at small liberal arts colleges for a very long time, but I have a deep passion and commitment to community colleges. I spent 2 years as a community college after my high school graduation, and it was truly one of the best decisions I made academically. My family has been involved in the community college where I come from a very long time, and so I appreciate the work that community colleges can do in educating the whole community. So to get started, I got slides. I don't usually talk from slides. I kind of dislike slides, but we're going to use slides. I did give you a handout that has the slides, right? I kind of hate it when I go to conferences and they read off the slides and then I have the slides in front of me. But I thought, everybody accesses information in different ways, so we'll try to get it out there in all the ways. Kind of before we get into this, I've been kind of stuck in a nostalgic mood lately. I talked to my dad on the phone last night. We're doing some travel right after the holidays, so we've been talking about that. I spent 2 hours with my parents on the phone on Tuesday night, trying to coordinate 3 different sets of plane tickets. My daughter, who's a sophomore in college, is going to study in Spain in the spring, and 2 hours with my phone trying to buy plane tickets. I wasn't sure I wanted to talk to my dad so soon again, but I called him last night, and we got into this conversation, coincidentally, about community colleges. When I was young, born, we're farmers. We come from a farm, and my dad was involved in livestock judging growing up, as I was too. And so after his master's degree, he came back to the community college to start a livestock judging team. And recently, one of his former contestants had called because the college is having an anniversary, a reunion for people that have been on this team. And it's for people that graduated 20 years ago. And so Dad's former contestant said, hey, we ought to crash this thing. And so Dad and I started talking about it. We were like, well, gosh, 20 years ago. I was graduated from the community college about 30 years ago. And he's like, yeah, and we started it. And he starts doing the math. And I was like, Dad, I was born in 1975. That was 48 years ago. But we kind of got stuck in this nostalgia of, gosh, 30 years ago. I graduated from high school 30 years ago. And emotionally, I'm having a bit of a struggle with that. Right? Because 10 years didn't bother me. 20 years I didn't really think about, but 30, that's 3 decades. So driving to work this morning, I was kind of thinking about this, like what I thought when I was in high school, what I thought today. And my daughter, I have this 19-year-old, she's about to turn 20, her name's Olivia. She tells me I'm stuck in the past. Right? And I started thinking about it, and there's one person in this room that knew me 30 years ago, and I think she would say that I'm probably wearing an outfit today that I very much would have been wearing, as a senior in high school 30 years ago. I like my daughter tells me I'm stuck in the past. I like to say the classics never go out of style. So I kept thinking, I drive a car that's about 30 years old. It's the car I would have wanted to drive in high school. Could I have been able to afford one of those? And if you'd asked me 30 years ago what my favorite word was, I'm a word person. I love words. I did debate and forensics in high school. I've always sort of worked in the economy of words. I would have told you that my favorite word was paradigm. And I think maybe that would still be the case. And so when we have a talk like this, I think this gives us an opportunity to think about our paradigms of thought. When we think in that way, especially as it relates to disability, which is really what we're going to talk about tonight. I could spend an hour talking about how I was 30 years ago, but that's not why you came. When we think of social change across decades or even centuries, we have to understand that we have different paradigms of thought in different times, and that we have an opportunity to update our thinking, to change our paradigms. And so as we consider this topic tonight, I really want to go back into the 20th century and talk about some of the different paradigms that existed as society viewed people with disabilities. And so I thought a good way to start was Thomas Kuhn talks about the 4 sort of states, the 4 sort of seasons that offer us change in life. And the first thing he says is we change sometimes because we've been in an experience that's caused us pain. And from that pain, we need to create a change. And I'm going to have to look at the slides again. I don't usually talk from slides. Sometimes we discover something that was previously believed to be impossible, right? Sometimes we find within ourselves, I used to think I couldn't do this. But now through a gradual step of experiences, I've come to a place where I believe that I can do this. And so sometimes that brings us change. Sometimes intuitively, a perspective opens up and we can see new possibilities. And that leads us to change. And finally, in his thinking is sometimes we develop new capacities, right? Sometimes we learn, right? Or we're given something that leads us to change. And so I think as we think about paradigms, as we think about social change, how people with disabilities have been perceived, encountered, and supported in the history of our country, thinking about how change can occur is a good way to start. This quote, disability is a natural part of the human experience. This is the thing that I probably say the most. I've taught about disability for a very long time. My experience with people with disabilities goes back more than 30 years. When I was 13, my dad, right, I'll probably talk about my dad a lot. If I'm half the person my dad is, I'm pretty proud of my life. I didn't know the term when I was 13. My daughter taught me this term. My dad voluntold me to go work at this summer camp. And when I said to he had gone to a meeting at our church, and ladies from our church were starting this summer camp in southern Kansas, where I come from. And they were looking for volunteers, and they couldn't find enough volunteers. And so the ladies had come to this meeting that my dad had gone to, trying to drum up volunteers. I was actually too young to volunteer. I was 13. You needed to be 14. But I've always been big, so they made a big exception for me that I could present like a 14-year-old. And so my dad said, "You're going to go do this." And I said, "But I don't want to do that." And he said, "I don't care." And I said, "Why do I have to?" And he said, "Well, it builds character." Right? And like a 13-year-old boy, I said, "But Dad, don't I have enough character?" Right? And I laugh at the asinine statement that was. But he shipped me off to this camp. I'd had no experience with people with disabilities in any way, shape, or form. Right? I was born in 75. Special ed law starts in 75. When I went to school, kids with disabilities were still in self-contained classrooms. They weren't in the elementary classrooms that I was in. And so I had very little experience with that. And honestly, I was petrified. I remember it was a Monday morning. My parents drove me over. It was about an hour away outside of Wichita, Kansas. And like I was in the back seat, I probably didn't speak a word for that hour, which is atypical, right? And was really terrified. I also didn't know anybody else that was going to be volunteering. And so I was going into this situation without any sort of social support, something new that I didn't know what to think about. And so I went, and the week went by, and by the end of that week, I knew exactly what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I wasn't sure how I was going to do it, but I knew that I needed to spend my life with people with disabilities. And that was a great gift, right, at 13, to be able to have that understanding, and all because my dad voluntold me to go do something. The people that I encountered at this camp just blew me away. And last June, I probably had to miss a meeting with Vicki and Steve because I flew back to Kansas to go to that camp for my 38th summer. Right? These are people that I've been friends with. 2 summers ago, before I moved here in 22, I went to camp, and that was a heavy experience for me because I thought it might be my last one. And so one night, there were 5 of the people, 5, we called them campers back in the day. 5 campers and I were sitting outside the dining hall at night, just on a porch and some rocking chairs like people do after dinner. And I've known, it was 4 women and a man, I've known these 5 people for 38 years. And so we're telling stories, we're talking about the old days and the people that started the camp. And it really dawned on me that I grew up with these people, right? They're just a few years older than me. We were kids together. I never really sort of put that into context when I was a child, right? And so these are people that I've lived my life with. And so when I was in graduate school, I encountered this quote, "This disability is a natural part of the human experience." The quote I give you tonight comes out of the Developmental Disability Assistant Bill of Rights, but this is also the preamble to special ed law. The first words of special ed law say disability is a natural part of the human experience. For a long, long time, when I came to Carroll County for years, I wore the same outfit every day, not like the same set of clothing. I had like 7 shirts, they were the same shirt. I did that because my daughter wore a uniform in high school and she loved it. Some of my friends were talking about their Catholic schoolgirl skirts from when they were in high school and how much they hated them. And so I went home one day and I said to Olivia, "You know, you wear this skirt every day. Like, do you like wearing that?" And she's like, "Oh my God, yeah, I love it." And I was like, what's the thing about it that you like? And she said, "I never have to make a decision about what I'm putting on in the morning." And I'm like, "Oh, you're right." So I adopted that behavior. Now I've lost some weight and I couldn't find the same 7 shirts, so I'm wearing some different things today. But my college students would note this about me and sort of make fun of me. And so one day, one of my students said, "Man, you're like a cartoon character." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, you know, like Charlie Brown, he wears the same shirt every day." I'm like, "All right, that's my new life goal. I want to be a cartoon character." And if I was a cartoon character, I'd have a thought bubble, right? Because that's how we know what cartoon characters are thinking and saying. They have a thought bubble. And if I had a thought bubble, disability is a natural part of the human experience is the thing that I would want in that bubble. I believe this fully. Now, the language after this in the quote, I'm not going to read it to you because I don't like going to presentations where people read me the slides. You've probably read it already, right? But we could take out that first statement about developmental disabilities and we could put any subgroup of American society into that statement. It would mean the same thing, right? Everybody should have access to these things. These are the sort of unalienable rights that we as Americans believe that we should have. This isn't just people with disabilities, this is all of us. We have to say people with disabilities in this statement because people with disabilities have not always had access to these things, right? We can probably list, we can come up, if I had a whiteboard, maybe, oh, there's one over there, don't tempt me. We could come up with a list with all the different groups of people that we could put into this statement, right? People with disabilities, like other people in American history, have been marginalized. And so we continue to work. Those of us that do the kind of work that I do, we're working to support and to advocate for the needs of people with disabilities. The next slide, it has the same statement on it. It also has that's me, back when I could sustain a head of hair. I can't do that anymore. My dad went bald when he was 27. I waited until my 40s, so I went, right? But this is a picture of me in a younger time with my grandma, right? My grandma's name is Jane. My niece's middle name is Jane. They share birthdays. She was born on July 16th of 1921. I didn't know that. I knew the July 16th part, but I didn't know the year, so I had to text my mom this week. My dad and I talk a lot. My mom and I don't talk so much. Mom and I have no beef. That's the slang that my daughter teaches me, right? We have no beef. There's no bad blood between us. We just don't talk a ton. Sometimes when I call her cell phone because I want to talk to her, she says, "Let me get your dad for you." Right? And so I had to text my mom, and she sent me back a long text, and I'm going to read it to you verbatim, because I had to say, "What year was Grandma Jane born?" And she says, "Mom and Dad," her mom and dad, my grandma and grandpa, were born in 1921. I think they were both home births. Mom said the day she was born was a hot July day, and the older kids and whoever else were around threw water at the screen door, hoping to cool off the air. She was born on a farm outside McPherson, Kansas, near Conway, the place where the Riddell kids live. Those are my cousins, right? So this is, my grandma was born in July of 1921. She grew up on a farm. I like to show the picture of my grandma. I miss my grandma. She passed away in late August of 2018. But I like to share her image and the story of her life for a couple of different reasons, 3 reasons really. And so the first, this is another story about my mom. When I was in college, I decided as a high school student that the only way I could see to have a professional life with people with disabilities was to become a special ed teacher. I didn't understand that there were other options out there, but being a farm kid, the professionals that you interact with the most are teachers. So I saw special ed teachers and I majored in special education. And I took a class, it's a class very much like one I teach today, Intro to Special Education. And I knew the experience that I had with people with disabilities, and my classmates had similar experiences. Some of them had babysat kids with autism, others had done other things. But I didn't know about other people in my life and their experience with disability. And so I wrote my mother a letter. This is before she would have had email. I think I had my first email address at that time. And so I wrote my mom a letter. I wrote several letters. And I wrote and just asked people, what is your experience with people with disability? What's your perspective? What paradigm of thought do you have about disabilities? And my mom wrote me back a 14-page letter, right? Which was shocking, right? We don't talk all that much. The previous Valentine's Day, I'd gone to the mailbox. I had this huge package that my mom's handwriting was on. It was full of all kinds of pink candy and a measuring tape. And there was a card, and I read the card, and she said, I'm knitting you a sweater. I need you to measure your shoulders. And by the way, give the candy to Maureen. Maureen was the girl I was dating at the time. Right? So I get this 14-page letter from my mom. The first statement of the letter is, I brought you into the world, I can take you out of it. Right? And she said, if you ever tell your grandmother that I have told you this story, I will take you out. And I think she was serious. Right? And so my mom, in this written letter, tells me about my great-uncle Paul. I'd never heard of great-uncle Paul before reading that letter. And she said, if you ever tell your grandma, right, this was a real threat. And so Paul, probably also born on that farm outside of McPherson, Kansas, about 30 miles from where I grew up, was born typically developed. He was born without any kind of disability, but in the late 20s or the early 30s, he contracted scarlet fever. Right? A very high fever that led to some brain damage, and so after that illness, he had a disability. My great-grandparents took him to the doctor in McPherson. The doctors told my grandparents that he should go to the county home, the institution, and they should forget about it. I come from Scotch-Irish people, right? We are very stubborn. We also like whiskey. And so I have a feeling that I can sort of predict the conversation that my great-grandfather had with this doctor. And I'm sure it had to do with where he could put that advice, right? And so they took Paul home to the farm. Mom said that Paul did not leave the farm after that day, that he was kept on the farm. He lived into his 30s, and that's really what my mom knew about him. And I thought, boy, I knew my other great aunts and uncles. I knew these Riddell kids, these cousins, but I'd never even heard Paul's name before. And so fast forward many years, in the 2010s, my grandfather passes away. We thought that my grandpa's health had been failing for a long time and that grandma was sort of propping him up, right? But grandpa passes away, and what we realize is the opposite is true. Grandma had dementia, and we didn't know it. And so grandpa passes away. The police call grandma's driving around 30 miles from home looking for Burger King. And so she has to go into an assisted living facility, right? So she moves in to the facility. Anytime I'm back home on the farm for the last 20 or so years, I've lived about 4 hours from where I grew up. We go to see grandma. It's not a fun visit. It's the thing I sort of put off until very often I'm stopping by the nursing home as I'm driving out of town because I put it off to the end. And in those early days, the visits were good because, she would ask about the kids, what sports are the kids playing? She loves sports. But then there was a period of time where we really couldn't talk about new things. And this really magical time happened because she started just telling me stories. And she started telling me stories that she hadn't told me when I was growing up, stories about her childhood of growing up on the farm and how the sisters would make the meals for all the farm hands every day at lunch. And then she starts telling me about Paul. And I'm Catholic, and I have a mother, so I'm easily controlled by guilt, right? I'm also from the Midwest. We don't have our own emotions. We have everybody else's emotions. That usually gets a bigger laugh. I can get it the second time, every time. And so I'm sitting there, grandma's telling me about Paul. I'm remembering my mother's letter. I'm like, oh man, these are my last days. How am I not going to tell mom about this? And so she tells me about her brother Paul. She corrected one of mom's facts that he did leave the farm. On nights where there was a full moon, great-grandpa would hitch up the team to a wagon and he would give Paul wagon rides on the county roads. And she talked about how Paul loved to do chores. And anytime it was one of the other kids' turn to cut wood, Paul would want to cut the wood. And I'm like, Grandma, you just Tom Sawyer'd your brother with a disability into chopping your wood. Right? And so she started telling me stories about her brother, stories that I hadn't heard before. Because in the 20s and 30s, people with disabilities were kept out of mainstream society, right? We had institutions. We had these long-stay hospitals that were really warehouses where people with disabilities went. Or I think we have lots of tropes, characters in novels. The one I like to think about is Boo Radley from To Kill a Mockingbird, right? In Macomb, Alabama, where that story is set. Anything that goes wrong in that town is blamed on Boo, even if there's evidence that someone else has done it, right? And so we sort of assume Boo is someone with a disability that's hidden away from society, that lives in the attic or the basement of a grandma's house. There's lots of characters like that in film and books. And so Grandma's life, right? So we have the story of Paul. I got to know about Paul. Grandma's life also works as a good timeline for as we consider the history of those with disabilities. She was born in the 1920s. Very literally, horsepower was a transportation that she relied on, right? On the farm, they used horses to do work. Grandpa was in the military between the World War II and the Korean War, right? So she saw horse travels, she saw cars. She was watching TV when we launched rockets that go to the moon. And then as the internet became a thing, my grandpa got very into computers. So she lived a life from I need a horse to go to town to I can communicate with someone on the other side of the world in a snap of the fingers, right? And so as we think about disability, there's one more thing that I want to talk about Grandma, but I think this is important first. We have to think about some different periods of time, right? And Grandma's life just happens to sort of span these periods of time. The first thing we think about is when America existed as an agrarian society. Right? Before 1900, 94% of families in America lived in direct agriculture production. Right? That means that work they did every single day was directly related to food on their table. Right? Now, I grew up in agriculture production, and I fed out a couple of show calves a year that I showed in 4-H that eventually went to slaughter, and that related to the hamburger, right, and the steaks and the roasts that we ate, but nothing else we ate came from our farm. We raised cattle and we grew food stuff for the cattle. That's not the same relationship with work and food. The population during this time in history was scattered across the country, right? It was small towns, it was one-room schoolhouses. When I teach people about this topic, unfortunately, my freshmen don't understand this anymore because they don't know Laura Ingalls Wilder, they don't know Little House on the Prairie, but this is the imagery I have for that period of time. Organizations were very simple, right? It's the general store in town where you sort of buy or order everything. It's the church, it's the one-room school. It's local governance of schools. But society becomes more complex, right? The Industrial Revolution, this is my mom's favorite time in American history, mechanized labor, changes how we do things. We can do more, we can do it more efficiently, we can manage that scientifically. And so our population shifts, right? We leave the farms, we leave the homesteads that we've cleared to raise animals and plant foods, and we move to the cities for those jobs in the factories, right? That changes where kids grow up. That changes the function of school in society. That has ripple effects through society. We move into the Depression, we move into World War II, we have post-World War II, right? Suburbanization. Now we move out of the cities into the suburbs. Cultural capital leaves the cities, moves to the suburbs. We have the rise of the professional class. As I study organizational theory, I read once that we thought there would be no more social problems in the world because a professional would work tirelessly to solve all social problems, right? The definition of a professional is someone who has access to specific knowledge and has been conditioned to the attitude and the disposition of their work, right? That's the definition of a professional. And someone that has access to specialized knowledge and has the dispositions of their work, why would social problems exist anymore? It seems like that hasn't worked out the way we thought, right? And then I've started talking about this digital revolution. And I think we're probably still in the middle of it, right? I think it's a little too early to sort of look back and say, this is the impact that the digital revolution had on society. I read a quote last week that in the 90s, the publisher of the New York Times wasn't going to have a website, and he said, until somebody can take the PC to the bathroom, we're not having a website. Well, I'm not going to tell you where my phone was about 3 hours ago. Right? I got my first email address as a freshman in college in 1994. I'm not sure the last time I put a stamp on a letter that I sent personally, right? We've changed the way we communicate. I can video conference, right? My daughter's going to be in Spain. She's going to have a mandate, to video chat with me probably once, maybe 5 times a day. We'll see. I've been very clear with her that I do not have a specialized set of skills that I can come rescue her, right? We can talk to somebody on FaceTime anywhere in the world in a matter of a moment. We have access to information that we've never had before. I read a quote that one day's edition of the Wall Street Journal contains more words than a person in our agrarian times would have seen in a year. We have access to more information. This is a threat to the professional class, right? How many of us go to the doctor with a printout from WebMD as our medical provider wants to hit us over the head with it? Right? Insurance changed when we had access to information, car insurance, because now we can go online and we can get quotes from lots of different car insurance companies in a second. So car insurance rates dropped, right? Access to information changes things. The other thing that the digital revolution gives us is access to a voice. Right? How many of you have been on social media today? Right? How many of you have posted on social media in the last week? I did. Tried to get more people to come to this morning, right? How many of you have created content for social media? Adam, our video guy, he's created some content today, right? Anyone can access through our phone, through a computer, through my watch, right? I can access a platform that allows me to have a voice to share my perspective with anyone who's willing to listen. And I think that's changed society. Now I'm going to go back one more because I want to say one more thing about this quote, disability is a natural part of the human experience. If I was with a group of college freshmen that I was going to teach for a whole semester, we'd have a long conversation about what this means. What does it mean that disability is a natural part of the human experience? And sometimes those conversations start sort of with the low-hanging fruit, as those kind of conversations often do. That, well, I have a cousin with a disability, or I know someone at church that has a disability, right? That we encounter others with disabilities. And then sort of the next level of fruit is, well, I have a disability. I'm teaching a class to college freshmen right now about disability in the media. Over half of them have some disability, right? So maybe we ourselves have a disability, and then someone will take another leap. Well, even if I don't have a disability, I have weaknesses. I have limitations, right? There's things that I need support with. I like to use the example that I'm asthmatic, so sometimes I need an inhaler. That makes me less effective at running. I don't like to run, so that's fine with me. I'm happy to have that limitation. When I see people running down the street, I want to roll down my window and yell, "No one's chasing you. It's okay, you can stop, get in, I'll give you a ride." Right? But we all have strengths and limitations. And then every once in a while, someone will get a step farther and they'll say, there may be a time in my life when I have more impairments than I have right now. This is really why I talk about grandma. Right? Because for most of my life, grandma was completely independent. This woman was not happy unless she was feeding you. Right? I'm a talker. We've picked this up already. She used to give me a chocolate chip cookie so I'd shut up. Right? But at the end of her life, she needed a vast amount of support that was different than she needed at other times. Right? Sometimes when I'm teaching teachers, I'll put up a picture of my kids. This is the first slide deck I built in a long time that doesn't have my kids in it because my kids have asked me to stop doing that. I don't know why, they're really good looking. They look way better than me, I like to show them off. But when I'm training teachers at the beginning of the school year, I'll put up a picture of my kids. And I'll ask them to get out their phones. Usually in the past, I would ask them to bring a picture of people that were important, but now we have all those pictures on our phones, right? So I'd have them get out their device. I'd say, I want you to take a minute and I want you to look at the people that are important to you. And then I would say, if the work you do as a teacher this year isn't good enough for those people, we need to have a different kind of conversation, right? That if the services that we do at Target aren't good enough for my own kids, we need to have a different kind of conversation. And this is where this gets a little depressing, because the reality is, I as a parent, I'm one car wreck away from my kids needing the kind of services that we provide at Target, right? Life changes. Things change. And so disability is a natural part of the human experience, cuts deep across our human experiences and those we interact with, and what we need, and what our loved ones need. And so I really do think this is an important concept. This concept for me comes with two fundamental beliefs that I cannot change in my life, right? We can talk about some paradigms that we can change. These are paradigms that I cannot change. I have a deep, unwavering belief that everyone is equal in dignity. There are no people that are more or less than another person, right? And I told you I'm Catholic. I have a spiritual and religious background. I don't practice as much as my parents would like me to, but I do come from that, right? And so from a religious or a spiritual perspective, we might say that all humans are formed in the image of a creator God, right? And so that means that we're formed in an image of perfection. If we don't access that sort of paradigm from a spiritual perspective, maybe from a humanist perspective, we would say that the conditions that are present for human life are so miraculous, right? The biological conditions that caused our lives exist in such a narrow band of tolerance. It's breathtaking, right? And so if whichever, or maybe both, maybe we hold on to both of those issues, or both of those perspectives. Maybe there's another perspective that you have on this issue. But when I think about that humanist perspective, these conditions that cause life, the conditions that exchange life exist in such a narrow tolerance. When we look at human DNA, all of us in this room, our DNA is 99% the same, right? But in that 1%, that's why I don't have any hair and you have a lot of hair and your hair is a different color than my hair and Adam's taller than I am. Right? But 99% of what makes us up, 99% of the code that our body uses to generate us is exactly the same. So why would we look to someone who has one chromosome different from us and say they're somehow different, they're somehow not normal, right? Down syndrome. Down syndrome exists because there's a third chromosome at the 21st pair. Someone with Down syndrome has one more chromosome than we have. They have some physical features that we can pick out, right? We used to always think that anyone with Down syndrome had an intellectual disability. I don't think that's true, right? Why would we look to one group that exists just a little bit differently in such a narrow band of tolerance and say that they're somehow worthless than we are, right? This is this belief that I cannot change, that we are all equal in dignity and worth. The other belief I cannot change, because somebody told me when I was a very young person that all means all. That everyone should have access to what we in a democracy believe is a common good. That everyone should access that. And I don't know if I just heard that when I was young and naive, but boy, I believed it. Right? And so when we face injustice in the world, when some people don't have access to what the rest of us have access to, that pisses me off, like at a deep core level, right? So these are two beliefs that I hold, two paradigms that I cannot change that inform this perspective. So that's sort of the precursor. I know I spent wow, okay, we're going to speed up. So there's sort of four questions that I want to talk about tonight. I sort of want to show you a couple videos. We'll see how that works based on time. They're good videos. But is it important to consider the needs or be concerned about those who learn and engage in society differently? Now, hopefully, I've already answered that question, right? Hopefully, if anybody came into this room tonight and thought, maybe not, I hope I've changed your mind on that already. But I'm guessing because you elected to come to this, right? We already shared some perspective there. So we won't spend too long talking about that. The next one, how have these people been treated in the past? I want to talk about inclusion, this idea that those of us who work in schools know because it's jargon, it's a term in school, but it has a broader social impact. And then maybe we don't answer this question. Maybe this is the question that you take with you when you leave tonight. What about our conversation tonight affirms things that you already believe, or maybe challenges some of your thinking, and maybe you do something different because of that? Right now, we can think back to those 4 reasons we changed. I don't want to cause you pain, right? I don't want you to walk out of here needing to change because you've experienced pain. But sometimes this conversation does create discomfort, as it makes us question things that we've thought about in the past. So we'll dig right in. So why is it important to be concerned about those who engage in society? Again, we're going quick on this one. I told you, or the advertisement for this event said you'd leave with some recommendations for things that you could read and watch. And so I built those into the slides. In the back of the slides, there's a reference list for these things. It's not an APA style. Steve, don't get mad at me. This is a man called Jean Vanier. Jean Vanier is Canadian. When he was 13, World War II broke out. And he said to his dad, "Dad, I need to go join the military. I need to join the Canadian Navy. World War II is breaking out." And his dad said, "Okay." And the first time I read Jean Vanier, my son was about 13. And I thought to myself, if my son came to me at 13 and said he was going to go join the Navy, I would have been like, "Dude, you can't pick up your room. How are you going to join the Navy?" But he did. And if you join the Canadian Navy during World War II, you're really joining the British Navy. And during the time of the war, he rose to the rank of a commander of a ship. When the war was over, he took a PhD in philosophy in Paris. That sounds pretty good to me. Somebody wants to pay me to do a PhD in philosophy in Paris. I might go. Sorry, Vicky. Just saying. Vicky's one of my bosses. But he goes to Paris. He studies philosophy. And then he goes to the University of Toronto, where he takes a position, a tenure-track position teaching philosophy. You don't leave those jobs, right? But after 3 or 4 years of teaching philosophy, he's like, "This isn't for me." He moves back to France, which seems like a good idea. He buys a house. He asks 2 people with disabilities to live with him. And in that act, he founded what is now an international movement called L'Arche. They exist in 90 countries around the world. They have homes, religious communities for people with disabilities. I've gotten to volunteer in a lot of these homes. I haven't been to France. I know some people that have. Some of my former students have started L'Arche homes in their cities. And so we really rest on this book that it's called From Brokenness to Community. It's a very short book. It's 52 pages long. You can get it on Amazon for about $7. And it's a published pair of lectures that he gave in the early 1990s at Harvard's Divinity School. They're great. The Christmas that I read this, a student brought this to me. She said, "We read this at the camp I work at every summer as a staff building exercise. You got to read it." I read it. Now I teach it. That Christmas, I gave the book to everybody I knew. Right? It's a great book. You should look at it. What Vanier says is the greatest pain is rejection. The feeling that no one really wants you like that. Now, when I'm teaching college freshmen and I need them to have perspective on disability, we can't always talk about disability because not all of them have experience with disability. Right? So I have to have a way to get into that conversation with them. And this line sometimes does it. Now, I didn't want to read you the slide. I didn't want to put all this on the slide because I do want to read it to you. Right? So I'm going to read this, not put it on the slide. It's the 2 paragraphs. It's page 13 of this book. "Our large communities," these are the communities that he founded, are also places of pain because they are founded on people who have been through great anguish. Today in richer countries, hospitals and asylums may be cleaner, but the same men and women are still there crying out for a home and for love. Big institutions cannot be a home. Sometimes people have been put in residences, but frequently these residences are not homes either because they're not accepted by their neighbors. After 25 years now, I've had the privilege of living with men and women with disabilities. I have discovered that even though a person may have severe brain damage, that is not the source of his or her greatest pain. The disabling condition is not the source of the greatest pain. The greatest pain is rejection. The feeling that nobody really wants you like that. The feeling that you are seen as ugly, dirty, a burden, or of no value. That is the pain I have discovered in the hearts of our people. And I don't think he's just talking about the people with disabilities. Right? Rejection is something that we've all experienced. This was my access point with those 18-year-olds. One very brilliant girl raised her hand one time, and the class conversation had got into romantic rejection. And she said, you know, sometimes when you're broken up with, you think the person is breaking up with you because of the things that you don't like about yourself that they don't know anything about. And through that rejection, you experience a false validation for these things that you think about yourself that nobody else knows about or maybe even believes. Right? I thought that was brilliant. I like to share that. Her name was Bridget. Right? Rejection is a common experience. Right? Rejection is painful. Rejection makes us question things about ourselves. How we think of others, how we conceive of others defines reality for the other. When I was learning to be a teacher, I had this professor. Her name was Olive Burns, Mrs. Olive Burns. She'd been a kindergarten teacher for 40 years. If you want a visual image of Mrs. Olive Burns, all you need to do is think about Mrs. Claus. This tall, this wide, giant pile of snow white hair, and her mantra was, nobody rises to low expectations. I can't not think about that, right? Nobody rises to low expectations, because if I expect less of you, you will perform less. How I conceive of you has power over you. How we conceive of others is important. How we conceive of others leads to this rejection. Right? So that's my short. Is it important to be concerned about those who learn and engage in society differently? You can also see some Vanier talks on YouTube. He is the most beautiful, soft-spoken man. You should check it out. So, history. How have these people been treated in the past? This is an image from an institution, right? Our treatment of people with disabilities in American society begins with institutionalization. Institutionalization is a concept that comes out of the 1700s, largely based on the philosopher Jean Rousseau, who felt that institutions could be a place for people with disabilities to experience self-development. It was a great idea, right? But like many great ideas that the government gets involved in, it was inefficient, it was very hard, it was very expensive. And so our institutions become prisons, right? They become warehouses. There's a documentary that you can watch called Willowbrook, right? You can find it on YouTube. Geraldo Rivera, who was like the Jerry Springer of my childhood, was once a serious journalist. The Kennedy family had a lot to do with Willowbrook going away because they had a child with a disability in that family. But it looks at what institutionalization was, what the effects of institutionalization were. We put people away. We took people out of society. We did not give them access to society. The next phase, right, is our paradigm shift as we begin to think about things related to disabilities and human dignity. We begin a process called deinstitutionalization. This happens in two waves in America in the 1950s and 1960s. We deinstitutionalize mental hospitals first, places for people with disabilities second. The image here, this is a man called Bill Sachter. One of the movies that you absolutely should watch is called A Friend Indeed, the Bill Sachter story. Bill Sachter had two made-for-TV movies made about his life in the 1980s. Mickey Rooney played Bill Sachter in the movie, and Barry Morrow is his friend. So at age 7, Sachter, his father's died, his mother takes him to school, they test him in school, they say he has significant sub-average intelligence. They tell the mom, put him in an institution. He goes to the Faribault Institution in Faribault, Minnesota. It's about an hour south of Minneapolis and St. Paul. My parents spend their summers in Minnesota, so I've driven by that institution a lot of times. He spent 44 years living there. And then deinstitutionalization happens. Bill is actually kept in the institution a lot longer because he's higher functioning. He's free labor. But eventually the institution closes. He moves out of the institution. He gets a job as a pot scrubber at a country club. And so he has a room where he stays at this country club. He scrubs pots. But he needs help doing things. And so he's always kind of bothering the waitresses and the waiters and the bartenders at the country club. But Barry's wife, Bev, kind of takes Bill under her wing. And she helps him make phone calls and do things. And then Barry says he wasn't really doing much productive in life. He was an encyclopedia salesman and he sold one set. I think his parents bought him. Becomes friends with Bill. And this is Bill's story after institutionalization with Barry, and Barry's access, or getting Bill access to the community. Barry and Bev get pregnant. Now Barry needs to make a living, and so he'd graduated from the University of Iowa, and so they moved back to Iowa City, where he takes a job doing AV stuff, or what we would today call IT stuff, in the School of Social Work at the University of Iowa. And they leave Bill, but Bill doesn't do well without their support, so pretty soon they move Bill down. And he goes to the dean of the School of Social Work and says, we got to find something to do with Bill. And so they hire him as a disability consultant with 44 years of experience. And they try to get him to do things at the college. He's not really good. They've got some old furniture that they want to refinish for the new building that's been built, so they try to get him to refinish furniture, but he always stands too far. And so finally they open a coffee shop in the lobby of this building, and they call it Wild Bill's Coffee, and Bill makes coffee. If you ever find yourself in Iowa City, you should go to the University of Iowa, because Bill's Coffee Stop is still open. Right? And so because of Barry's support, Bill has a meaningful life. Bill was like the international spokesperson for people with disabilities. He won all kinds of awards. And at the end of this film, Bill says, like, I really wonder if Bill hadn't have been institutionalized, if he had been born in a time where he could go to school. Because when they dress him up and they take him to Washington, D.C. and to Canada to receive these international awards, he looks like a distinguished gentleman. What would have Bill's potential been had he not been institutionalized? What does it mean to be significantly sub-average intelligence, right? There was a period of time. Today, when we think about people with intellectual disabilities, we start talking about that at about an IQ of 70, 2 standard deviations below the mean. There was a short time in the 20th century where the APA raised that to 85, right? There are very, very successful people with 85 IQs. Bill could have been one of those people, we don't know. And so this is deinstitutionalization, taking people out of the institution, putting them into the community, building services within the community. The next slide I'll show you. My freshmen don't know this movie. Anybody know this movie? Rain Man, thank you. My gosh, I've been trying to get 18-year-olds to watch this movie all semester. Right, so Rain Man comes out in the late 1980s. Fun fact. We know that's Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise is a little controversial right now. Maybe we watch his movies, maybe we don't. This is one that's worth going back to. Dustin Hoffman plays the first character that we see in a major motion picture with autism. Right? Rain Man's character is based on a man called Kim Peek. Kim Peek is a Salt Lake City, Utah man. He has autism. He gets referred to as the human encyclopedia. He would go do these public events where people would ask him random facts. What day of the week was October 13th in 1722? And he knows. Right? He would read, his favorite place was the Salt Lake City Public Library. He would read 7 or 8 books a day. He could, anybody a student right now? Anybody studying here at Carroll? How many classes you got? How's your reading? Got a lot of reading?
I have brain injury.
Okay. Okay. But do you have, you have a lot of reading assignments? Right. So Bill opened a book. With his left eye, he could read the left page, while simultaneously his right eye read the right page. Had about 93% retention. Right? I got to read a page at a time. I don't think I have 93% retention. Right? They think Bill, the corpus callosum, the center part of our brain that separates the two hemispheres, he didn't have a corpus callosum. And they think that he was able to read that way and retain all of that information. Right? So Barry Morrow, remember him? This guy that sort of looks like a hippie that became friends with Bill. Barry Morrow also becomes friends with Kim Peek. Barry Morrow writes the screenplay for Rain Man. Right? Rain Man is a great movie, right? It's totally worth watching just because it's a great movie. Rain Man is groundbreaking in American society because American society didn't know the word autism before, I think it's 1988, it might be 1986. We didn't have a conversation about the autism spectrum disorders before this movie. Right? Barry Morrow is a key uncelebrated figure in the normalization movement. Because after deinstitutionalization, we have to normalize. Because all of these people were kept out of society. There was shame associated with having a child with a disability. We didn't take those kids into public. But we have to make that okay. This is the normalization movement. right? Creating space, creating acceptance for people with disabilities within the community. So Rain Man does that really, really well. Barry Morrow. I would like to meet that guy someday. So I've started talking about this for years and years and years. I've talked about institutionalization, deinstitutionalization, and normalization. I've started talking about post-normalization. Right? Remember how we talked about the agrarian society, the industrial society, the professional society, the digital society? I think post-normalization occurs alongside digital society. This is a woman called Rebecca Towson. She has a book called Sitting Pretty. She's a Kansas City author. I knew her when she was studying for a doctorate at KU. She's in English, she writes. Rebecca became known because of Twitter, and I don't know what it was. I'm not great with social medias. I have one Snapchat friend. I sometimes watch the old people TikTok, which I think they call Instagram Reels. Right? I'm not good. I've never created anything that way for social media. We got Adam to do that at Target and Gail. But through Twitter, Rebecca Towson found a voice, a platform. Now, she has a physical disability. And one of the things, we brought her to my old campus to talk with our students. One of the things that's very difficult for her as a wheelchair user, she's not in a wheelchair, she's a wheelchair user, was accessibility in housing. And so she had our students do an activity where she had them get out their devices to pick a geographic city and to identify whether they could rent an apartment in that city that was accessible. And so you can go online and in these apartment finder things, you can find these kinds of apartments. And then she would have them pull up the image of those apartments and say, okay, what is accessibility? And maybe the door's wide. Maybe we can get in, right? Or maybe there's an elevator up to the apartment where we can, get up to a floor and then get in the apartment. But she said, what about the counters? Are the counters regular height or are the counters lower? What about the bathroom? Can I roll my wheelchair into a shower or is there a lip? Right? So Towson was able to use her social media presence, her platform, to expose the rest of us to lived experience that we're not familiar with. Right? Because when I was taking that special ed class in college, we had to do some things to mimic having a disability. And so we all had to spend a day in a wheelchair. And I've existed on 2 hilly campuses in my life, McDaniel and Benedictine. And we all tried to kill ourselves riding the wheelchairs down the big hill with someone riding on the back, right? We weren't really taking that seriously. We really didn't have to live a life without access. We have things like ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that says buildings have to be accessible. At my old college, we built a new academic building. Looks like Merritt Hall if you've ever been on McDaniel's campus. And I was on the committee that advocated for students with physical disabilities. I often wanted to do physical harm to our facilities manager. One time we had a student who used a power wheelchair, had cerebral palsy, brilliant, had graduated from a community college, top of his class, already had a consulting business doing IT things. He asked for one accommodation when he came to campus, and he said, your campus is very hilly. When it's snowy and icy, my wheelchair doesn't get up hills very well. Can I please get a ride on the days that it's snowy and icy? And for some reason, our campus couldn't figure out how to do that. And the director of facilities, I was sitting in this meeting with the president's cabinet, and the director of facilities said, well, if we make it easy for him, how many more of these people are going to come here? And it took everything in my being not to crawl across the table with my fountain pen and gouge people's eyes out, right? But unless so this building is ADA compliant, right? So it means it has the bathroom suites, that's what I call the stalls that are extra big. I sometimes like to use that stall just because I like the space, right? Sometimes those handholds, they hold the phone nicely, right? If I'm watching the old people TikTok, no, I'm just kidding. Or am I? But this building, when you walked into this building, it had one of those buttons on the door, right? I was at the student center on McDaniel's campus buying some things at the student store the other day, and they were big, heavy things. They were diploma frames, and I was trying to get out the door, and so I elbowed that button and the door opened, and that was really convenient because sometimes accommodations don't just work for people with disabilities, they work for everybody. But at this campus, you walked into this building, you could push a button on the wall, the doors would open, you would walk in and you were confronted with 2 options, a staircase. If I'm in a wheelchair, I can't use the staircase, and then 2 giant oak doors, like as tall as the ceiling in here, oak doors. No button for those doors. So the building's handicap accessible. I can get in the building and I can look at stairs and doors until someone comes along to open it for us, right? So through social media platforms, people with disabilities are giving the rest of us access to their lived experience. I think this is post-normalization. This is another one. Okay, if you have not seen this, has anybody seen the Peanut Butter Falcon? Gail has, that's good. Allie has, that's good. If you have not seen the Peanut Butter Falcon, please go watch it tonight. Right? I think we have time. Do we have time? Are we good? Well, no, like 9 minutes. I'm going to say we have time. If you got to leave, I won't be mad at you. You got the slides. Uh-oh, we had volume a minute ago.
How are you thinking with those two? I would say Zoa and decoder.
You let a half-naked boy with Down syndrome who has no idea how to get along in this world just slip out from under your nose.
Actually,
The nurses tell me you two are close.
Yeah.
Fine, then.
I'm Tyler, I'm Michael, and we are the writers and directors of the Peanut Butter Falcon. So we met Zach 8 years ago at a camp for people with disabilities that we were kind of hanging out at, and we were all having dinner, and he said, I want to be a famous movie star, and Mike said, yeah, it's probably not going to happen, man.
That's a part of the population that doesn't traditionally have characters written for.
Yes, in Hollywood, a lot of people aren't writing and making films starring people with disabilities. And Zach got very emotional and just said, well, why don't you guys make it for me? And we decided Zach should have the same opportunities as any other actor in this industry, and decided to write him a feature film.
Excuse me! What do you think I'll make?
So we made this proof of concept to show that Zach could do the acting job, and then we sent it to people. We sent it to Shia LaBeouf, we sent it to Dakota Johnson. That proof of concept really got us our cast, crew, and producers, and people saw that Zach had a talent and then signed on to make that movie.
You don't really get that often the really special material that, makes you, weep and smile and laugh. It's the reason why you get the movie business, you know what I mean? It's Stand By Me, it's The Goonies, it's like all those special movies that, you remember for the rest of your life.
I'm here because I felt that this whole thing had a chance to be lightning in a bottle.
And what we did is we took pieces of Zach's real life, things that he liked, wrestling, swimming, parties, and worked it into a script.
With Tyler and Mike, we're in a constant conversation all the time. When we get off set, it's still going all night, all day. Songs, pictures. What does an actor want out of a director? Somebody to lean on and somebody who's got the wherewithal to hire the right people and trust those people. These dudes do that. They're brilliant.
I was attracted to the script because of the title, because of the people involved, and the script itself I thought was a little piece of magic.
So you've got this baseline story that's fantastic, and then you've got your lead character who really has Down syndrome. Talk about expectations being blown, and then with Shia, and then you add in Dakota. They're family. They became a family from week 1 on this film.
I'm looking for a missing person. Have either of you gentlemen, I'm assuming I can use the word gentleman. Have you seen him?
Well, what are you doing?
Met your girlfriend back there, Eleanor. Cute one from the old folks' home. She likes you quite a bit. Got a picture of you and everything, showing everybody. Hell yeah. Too bad it's on the run. Oh yeah! How you doing, partner?
Everybody who comes here is touched being here. It's kind of a weird magical thing going on. It feels like a big family of misfits, but it feels like familiar. It's cool. Oh man, Zach for sure. Actually, Zach isn't a misfit. Zach is one of the purest, most intensely good people I've ever known.
He's incapable of dishonesty, and he comes up with very spontaneous, emotional moments.
Oh, Zach's cool as shit, man. Tried to rap battle me first day. Tried to hand it to me. He did. I lost that one.
When did we start to feel like family?
I know.
Go.
When we were first on the raft, all the three of us,
Yeah.
and the sun was setting.
Yeah.
What is it like to work with Zach?
It's kind of like the best experience I've ever had, the best relationship I've ever had in a working environment, but also in just not life environment.
Remember when our songs were just like prayers, like gospel hymns that you called in the air.
We are making a movie of the Peanut Butter Falcon.
Who are you?
I am the Peanut Butter Falcon.
I've never had a co-star like him, man. Not on no charity shit. He's just so brilliant. That dude is so brilliant. He's so open. I mean, he's so open. The best actor, best you could ever ask for from an actor is to go like this. For real. It's the best you can ever get out of an actor. The height of this craft is when a dude goes like this, and Zach stays like this.
We really just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to watch the EPK. Thank you for watching the film. It has been a labor of love, but love is the most important word in there, and it makes me happy that my family, that we can share this with you, and thank you. Thanks.
I don't really show you that because I want you to go watch the movie. I do want you to go watch the movie. Uh-oh. Oh, I did it right. That's amazing. Okay, I do want you to go watch this movie. If you've never seen this movie, you should see this movie. I saw it 5 times in the theaters, 5 nights in a row. It was the same week my grandma died. No, that was the other grandma. We won't talk about her tonight. My daughter has her middle name. We come from a town about this size. The theater in town, the guy that ran it wasn't going to bring this to the theater because he didn't think it would sell enough tickets. It was like a 2nd or 3rd tier movie, and I was like, we got to bring it. And he said, if you'll cover the cost, it cost me $250 to rent the film for a week. If you'll cover the $250, I'll bring it. And I said, okay, that's cool, but if you make enough ticket sales to cover it, you don't charge me. He said, fine. We sold it out 5 nights in a row. Right? I gave my students extra credit. But the 5th night, the local child care center who serves lots of kids with disabilities, they came in, they said, hey, we want to go, and will you give us a talk afterwards so that can be our professional development for this semester? Yes, I will. Right? It is a beautifully written movie. It's a beautifully shot movie. It's a beautiful story. Zach's a beautiful actor. But the reason I show you this movie, or I show you this clip, is for the interview. Right? Because they said, Zach's at this camp, I want to be a movie star, and they're like, not going to happen. Right? Because for most of our history, when people with disabilities have said things, we've said, not going to happen, let's do something else. Right? The kid in the IEP meeting that says, I want to be on the basketball team, let's make you the water boy. Right? The kid who's blind that says, I want to run track, you can do the laundry. Right? We have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. Right? We have to move past paradigms. We have to move past these outdated ways of thinking and create access. These filmmakers did it, right? Zach said, I want to be a movie star. You should write the movie for me. So they did. Right? How many of us have a goal that somebody said at the beginning, probably ain't going to happen, but we made it happen? Right? Maybe it wasn't easy. Maybe we had to work at it for a really long time. Maybe it cost a lot of money and cost us a lot of sleep and cost us a lot of time, but it was our dream and we did it. Everybody should have access to that. Right? Zach's a man with Down syndrome. He wanted to be a movie star. He's been in some other things, but that's a masterwork. Right? Because some other people said, yeah, we can do that. Our society for a long time, how we've treated people with disabilities has been to not give them that access. Right? At Target, we talk a lot about employment. When we say meaningful day services, we're talking about vocational services. People want jobs, right? We get value from jobs. My identity is completely wrapped up in my job, right? I go to sleep at night and sleep because of the identity I have in the work that I do. This is pivotal. Like outside of being a parent, I don't know what's more important to my identity than the work that I do. It brings us great meaning in our lives. It gives us satisfaction. It makes us feel productive. It makes us feel like we're contributing. But people with disabilities haven't always had access to jobs, right? Back in the 80s, we had these things called sheltered workshops where people with disabilities got to work and they got to do very menial tasks for pennies. And they were separate from society. And then we started towards community employment. I had a conversation last week with a guy that owns a car stereo shop in town. And he said, boy, you know, if you guys ever have a summer individual who wants to come work here, we'd love to give him a job. And he's like, you know, we'll teach him how to do car stereos. And I'm sure there's a high school kid with a disability that we serve that wants to do car stereos. I want to do car stereos, right? Last year I was at a grocery store and the guy's like, man, I can't find people to hire. I can't find people to work here. And I said, well, you know, we have this employment services. We can help people with disabilities get jobs. And he's like, well, can't they, you know, isn't the only thing they can really do is to bring in the shopping carts? Come on, man. Like it was all I could do not to gouge his eyes out. I'm not really a violent person. Right? We've been limited in our concepts. The next sort of waves are employment where people without disabilities creating businesses where people with disabilities could have jobs. And sometimes that's good, but sometimes it's really bad, right? Because people without disabilities are profiting on sort of the objectification of people with disabilities. The stuff that we need to move forward to is how do we help people with disabilities create their own jobs, their own businesses? Right? How do we create opportunities for people like Zach experienced because he was at this camp and just happened to meet these people one day, right? But you should go watch this movie. It's an amazing movie. I always say his name wrong, Shia LaBeouf. I don't know how to say it. Teenagers get mad at me. But he said, you know, the best thing an actor can do is to rip themselves open, right? This movie will rip you open. If you're in one of those moods where you need something that rips your heart open, watch this movie. Inclusion. So we're at the 75-minute mark. I feel like if we jump off that cliff, we're going to be here for another 75 minutes. Nobody wants that. I'm getting hungry. You want me to stop talking? Give me a chocolate chip cookie. All right. So that's probably a good place to start. Maybe we can do this again. We can get into to the inclusion topic another night. It's important for us to know where we've come from, right? It's important that I still wear brown corduroy pants and Birkenstocks, just like I did 30 years ago. It's important that we understand where we came from. It's important to hold on to the values of the past that are important and serve our current and future paradigms, right? But it's also important to know where we're going and to know what needs to change. And we're still in this process, even though we might call it post-normalization, we're still in the process of giving people with disabilities the same access to the community that you and I have. Right? That's where we're going. And that's what our work has to focus on. That's the pie in the sky that we're chasing. Okay? So there's more slides. You can look at those. I tell you more movies to watch, I think. This is inclusion. Stella Young, you should watch this one. Stella Young's a disability advocate. She's passed away. This is an amazing video. There's the link. It's in the resources. These are other things we can talk about. This is the list of the things that you could watch. Also, the very last slide, if you'd like to get to know Target and the work we do, here's our socials. There's QR codes. I think you just hold your phone up. It magically appears. All right, I can't explain it, so it must be magic. I think that's what Steve Jobs said. Probably somebody else said it first. Okay, I think we have some time for questions. Continue the conversation. I got a microphone hanging out of my pocket. That feels weird. Oh, now it's not in my pocket anymore. Sorry, Adam. Breaking your stuff. Yes, ma'am. Lisa, right? Yeah. Oh, the fact that I remember that for 75 minutes? Yeah. Also miraculous. Thank you.
So we talked a lot about disability that is visible.
Yeah.
Isn't it something like 70 or 80% of disability
is invisible, right? That's absolutely the case. For a long time, even at the beginning of special ed, right, we were talking about people with physical disabilities. But now we know there's lots of disabilities that we can't see, right? Families of kids on the autism spectrum talk about this, right? That the mothers feel a lot more judged in public when they have a child with autism that's having a hard time because we can't see that that child has autism. right? But we also think about mental health issues. One of my other sort of side, I won't call it a side hustle, but my side passion is that we should be able to talk about mental health issues in the same way we talk about physical health issues, right? Anybody ever had their appendix out? 1, 2. 2 of you don't have all your organs. Congratulations. Anybody ever broken a bone? Not me. Tonsils? Everybody got our tonsils? Okay. I would never ask a group of people in this situation, have you ever had depression? Right? I have a lot of social anxiety myself. I have to do some complex things to manage that. Right? That says that there's stigma around mental health issues that we don't have around physical health issues. That needs to change. The mental health issues are a hidden disability. Things like ADHD are a hidden disability. Right? So we can encounter people. I see the quote on Facebook a lot, you need to be nice to everybody because everybody's fighting a battle that we know nothing about. We may encounter people in society that have a disability that we can't see. And they should have the same right to accommodations that people with visible disabilities have. I'm glad you asked that. Thank you. Steve.
Matt, we talk a lot in the school system about over-identifying
Yeah.
special education. Is it a good thing to acknowledge disabilities and give the accommodations, or are we doing?
Well, so if we talked about inclusion anymore, we sort of would have gotten to this point. I would love to live in a world, because in special education, right, if we receive special ed services, we have to have a classification to get into services, right? Now, you told us that you have a brain injury. Thank you for sharing that. Did you have those in high school?
No.
Okay. Now, I think that I know that most traumatic brain injuries occur when we're toddlers and when we're adolescents. You were an adult? Yeah. Okay, so you had an injury. And you had a stroke. Okay. And that left you with a condition that you didn't have before. Yeah. Right? So someone is classified or categorized. It's not necessarily a medical diagnosis. Those are different things. Special ed teachers do not have the MD, doctor after the name. My daughter likes to remind me I'm not a real doctor. Right? It's fine. So we can't diagnose, but we classify. A classification is like a general admissions ticket to a concert. I'm going to a concert tomorrow night in Philadelphia. I'm going to a concert on Saturday in DC. I'm super excited. I'm a Grateful Dead fan, Grateful Dead jam band. Going to have a good time. Right? One night we have seats, one night we have general admission. At the Met in Philly, we have seats. Our tickets are going to say what seats we go sit in. When we go to the Anthem, I think that's what it's called in DC, it's general admission. We got a ticket that gets us in a door. It doesn't tell us where to sit. A classification to get into special ed is a general admission ticket. It says we can get into the services, but it doesn't say what the services have to be. Right? So all of us in this room could be classified as having ADHD, and we could all have different services. In the same sort of theoretical extreme, we could all have different disabilities and have the same services. So we have to talk about over-identification. We think that disability occurs in the population at about 14%, right? Depending on geographic areas, urban areas it's a little higher, suburban areas it's definitely a lot lower. But if we look at the nation as a whole, about 14%. So because in special education we have to worry about something called cost containment. Special education is an underfunded mandate. The federal government says we have to do it. The federal government doesn't give states money to do it. And so there's restriction in access. So we ask the question, are too many people getting in? Right? Are too many people coming to this concert? Are there too many people being identified? Now, I think the problem is we have to have a label to get services. Why don't we just not have the label, and if the kid needs something, we just do it? Right? I would have shown you a picture in the inclusion of this beautiful staircase. It's in Vancouver, Canada. Well, heck, I can show you the picture. It goes back. This staircase, Vancouver, Canada, it's a public staircase. And I should have maybe had Adam build these slides because it probably would have looked better. But this is a staircase through 2 levels of a city. You've got your traditional steps that I like to avoid because gravity's never been on my side. Right? And so if I don't want to walk up the stairs, there's a ramp in the middle that I can walk up. Right? Or I also have some arthritis now. Love admitting that. And maybe I am going to challenge myself and walk up the stairs, but I got a handrail. right? So if I am a person who can walk upstairs, this staircase works for me. If I'm somebody that needs support walking up the stairs and that's a handrail, I can do that. If I'm someone who wants to kind of shuffle up the stairs, I can take the ramp. If I'm a wheelchair user like Rebecca Tossin, I can roll up the ramp, right? This is a model of inclusion that operates on a principle called universal design. Universal design says we think about access at the beginning, right? So probably when Steve was trained to be a teacher, which was a year or two before I was trained to be a teacher, just a couple, right? You're probably a senior when I was a freshman. We don't have to go there. Oh, okay, well, okay.
But I have the hair gene.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I'd take white hair. I'd take any hair. 90% of this is bald by choice. I'd just like to compensate. So when Steve and I were taught to be teachers and we were taught to design lessons, we were said, okay, you're going to teach third graders and you're going to teach this math concept. There's this process called Madeline Hunter lesson design that we all know, anticipatory sets, those kinds of things. Steve was probably writing down my anticipatory set earlier. And after we created the lesson, then the professor would say, okay, you've got 2 kids with ADHD, you've got 1 kid with a specific learning disability in the area of reading, accommodate the lesson to them. Well, that's an awkward fit, right? Because what we really need to do is to think about difference at the beginning of the design. This staircase thought about, the architect that designed this staircase thought about difference as he was drawing the design, or she was drawing the design. Right, my mom has multiple sclerosis. She's never been in a wheelchair, but she might be. And so my parents have spent summers in Minnesota. They spend winters on the family farm in Kansas. It seems weird. But they've had to do some remodeling of their houses so that if she's ever confined to a wheelchair, they can live on one level. And so the bathrooms are awesome. I love the bathroom, especially in Minnesota, right? Because you walk into the bathroom, and it's like, they call it a wet room, which makes me think of Guantanamo Bay and some sort of torture that I don't really understand, but I like to watch spy movies, right? But it's floor to ceiling tile. There isn't a tub. There isn't a bathroom stall, right? Because if I take a shower in the morning before I'm caffeinated and I have to step into the tub, that's dangerous. I might fall, really, right? And even if I have a sort of normal shower, there's a lip, and my wheelchair might not go over the lip. So they just have a stall with a curtain across it, so it's like this cavity in the wall, and they have a shower head on each side. And it's great for my mom, because if she needs to roll a wheelchair in there, she can take a shower. It's also great if you're in charge of the kids who have been in the lake all day, right? I don't know about your family and my family, we all have a picture of all of our cousins naked in a bathtub together, right? This is a universal thing. Some people are laughing. Well, my brother and I, his family, they live in the Twin Cities. I lived in Kansas. We'd all go up at the same time. They have 3 kids. I have 2 kids. My brother and his wife always stayed at a hotel in town. I never really figured this out. But then they would leave at like 7 o'clock at night, right as things were winding down. And one year, my brother's wife hands me a list. And she says, you got to do this for the kids before they go to bed. And I looked at her and I said, I am not your babysitter. Right? But very often, I was the one that needed to hose off the kids after they'd been in a lake all day because mom didn't want them sitting on the furniture smelling like lake water. Right? You can round 5 kids up into that kind of shower stall really easily. It's also good for me in the morning before I've had coffee. And my parents aren't coffee drinkers. I'm showering a lot in Minnesota not being properly caffeinated. The accommodations and the modifications that Special Ed has developed is not magic fairy dust that we're sprinkling atop your head because you need the accommodation. These accommodations and modifications work for everybody, right? We may have kids, so Steve talked about over-identification, there's also under-identification. What about the kids that almost have a disability but can't get into services? If I'm a general ed teacher, I'm practicing universal design, I'm thinking about access for everyone in the curriculum at the onset. Those kids that haven't been identified are benefiting from those things, right? The next image is a zero-entry pool. When I lived in Kansas City, we went to a local, I don't know what it was called, recreation type place, and they had a zero-entry pool, and it was amazing because my kids were little. Zero-entry pool, like you walk in like a beach, you don't have to climb down rickety staircases, right? I loved it for my little kids. There were people in wheelchairs, there were older people. that use the wheelchair or the pool because they could get in. These pools were developed in physical rehab centers, right? Because aquatic therapy is good because I float, right? There's less resistance. If I have to do physical therapy after a knee reconstruction or something, doing it in water is better. And if you have to get people from a wheelchair into a pool, not always super dignified. Like, I'm sorry, if I'm in a bathing suit in a wheelchair and you got to get me in a pool, please don't touch me. I don't want to be up in anybody's business that way. I don't want lifted out of my wheelchair. But if you can roll my wheelchair in, that's better. It's less injury for staff. It's less awkward for me, right? Doesn't just work in physical rehab. It also works when you've got toddlers. These accommodations and modifications, these changes we've developed can work for everybody. So is there sometimes a problem with over-identification? Yeah. ADHD is one right now. There's a guy called Jeffrey Duncan Andrade who says it's not actually ADHD, it's a traumatic stress response that's causing ADHD-like behavior. So we got all these kids that we're now putting on stimulant medication that have no business being on stimulant medication. That's a problem we got to think about. There's a guy called Colin Ong Dean, ONG-Dean. He has a book called Distinguishing Disability. He looks at it from another perspective because often when we think about identification, we look, do marginalized people have the appropriate access to these services? He takes the other route and said, do people of privilege have access to these services? We find over-identification in families with lots of cultural capital. Right now, it's the autism spectrum. Colin Ong Dean calls it the designer disability. In the 70s, it was a learning disability instead of the words we don't say anymore, mental retardation, right? Because there was less stigma associated with that word. So we could do 45 minutes on this topic. Okay, what else? I hope you guys are having half as much fun as I am.
So I've had friends that work for Target.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, but they worked in Target houses.
Yeah.
I just want to know what other services Target.
Yep. So Target really operates in 3 spaces. We have our residential homes. So for those of you Carroll County residents that don't know this, we have 7 group homes here in Carroll County. Vanier talks about how those residents sometimes aren't accepted into the community. The group homes that I worked at in college were home to 8 or 9 or 10 people. Our group homes have 3 people because that's a more natural environment, right? So we have residential space. We also work in the employment space. The state of Maryland calls those meaningful day services because the state says everyone that's of employment age should be meaningfully engaged in the community throughout the day. Not the most person-centered thing, right? Because we have 50-year-olds who have Down syndrome and dementia who are really not capable of working, right? So some of those programs happen in our offices. We have classes and job development. Some of it is being employed out into the community. And then we have personal supports. And so the rise of vocational and personal supports is a factor of time, a shifting in paradigm, right? I'm born the same year as special ed. Anybody my age or younger has benefited from special education, has benefited from personal development through schooling. Somebody older than me might have gone to an institution at birth or a group home at adulthood because we didn't ever develop them towards independence, right? A 21-year-old finishing school now may go into their own apartment because we've developed these skills, but they may need help at their apartment or engaging in the community. And so personal support does that. So in personal support, if I'm a participant in personal supports, the state has said I have this number of hours a week that I can receive supports. And so our folks spend that time with them, helping them at home, helping them in the community. That's the kind of best jobs in our program. Don't tell anybody I said that. I do tell the director of that program it's the best job because sometimes on Saturdays they go on field trips to museums in New York City and Hershey Park. They get to go have fun with people in the community. We do some other things as well. We do some summer youth employment, so job development for kids in the Carroll County Public Schools, and then we run the autism waiver program for the Carroll County schools. And the meaningful day and the personal support in the residential also happens in Montgomery County. So we're in Carroll and Montgomery County.
Do you offer like a therapy component?
Most of the therapy is happening in private providers outside of our agency. Yep. Okay, what else? Yeah.
Why did you say that autism spectrum disorder is a designer disability?
because it has less stigma than other disabilities. So if a school system is considering a child, they're doing an evaluation to determine whether or not they receive services, parents with cultural capital will push for an autism diagnosis. Because as we think about autism in sort of the zeitgeist right now, like autism's having a real moment, right? People that are neurodiverse, very active on social media, and so parents are pushing for that diagnosis because it doesn't have the same negative stigma. The parallel is in the 70s when we were identifying kids as being, and again, this is outdated language, but mentally retarded. Lots of stigma around that, right? No parent wants to walk out of a meeting thinking, oh, my child's mentally retarded. So parents with social capital would push for a less stigmatizing diagnosis, a learning disability. And so there's political action within special education around how classification goes. Similar, so my special ed background is all in students with severe emotional and behavior disorders. I love working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I can't teach those people. It's the same every day, and I get in a lot of trouble if I have work that's the same every day because I get bored and I entertain myself, and not everybody else likes that. So I taught in psychiatric hospitals because it was never the same. And so we'd go into IEP meetings and we'd have plenty of medical diagnosis saying that this child had a severe emotional or behavior disorder, and a parent would say, not signing that piece of paper. That label's going to go with my child for the rest of their life. I'm not signing them into services. Everybody agreed they needed the services. Everybody agreed that they were better off with the support, but that stigma blocked that. And so I would say, and I'm not going to admit this to any special ed administrators right now, but there's another disability category called other health impairment, OHI. If you were in school, you would have an OHI, right? Anybody ever heard of OHI before? A couple of us, right? Any stigma around OHI? Like I could wear an OHI t-shirt, nobody know what it means, right? So I would say to that parent, you know, we got this stack of diagnosis from psychiatrists. Psychiatrists are doctors. Doctors work in medicine. Medicine is health. What if we call this an other health impairment? And they're like, oh yeah, I'll sign for other health impairment because it's a general admissions ticket. Doesn't matter what label we get them, we just need to get them into the services, and then we develop an appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. So it's all about stigma.
What harm is happening to the children if they, you know, are having this experience, but then the parents like try and guide toward ASD? Like what's happening to the children? Like, are they not being properly supported then? Like, what is their path?
It's probably as much parent perception as anything else, right? And so a story I sometimes tell Olivia when she was a kindergartner. Both of my kids had some speech challenges when they were very little. And so I have friends that are speech pathologists. And so my friend Alyssa came to dinner twice, right before Henry started kindergarten and right before Olivia started kindergarten, because I was concerned about their speech. And she was my friend. We'd been friends for a long time. She came to dinner. When dinner was over, I walked her to her car. Dear Henry was starting kindergarten. I was like, what do you think? And she's like, his stuff's going to iron itself out. Don't worry about it. And then 4 years later, it's Olivia's turn. We walk out to the car, and she's like, I think you need to have Olivia evaluated. Right? So I called the principal at the school, Tom. I put a lot of student teachers in this building. I knew Tom pretty well. I said, hey, Tom, Olivia's starting kindergarten. He's like, oh, it's going to be so great to have one of your kids in our building already. And I'm like, Henry's a third grader. And I said, I need to do a parent request because parents can request to have their child evaluated for special education. I need to request that Olivia be evaluated for speech. And so her mom and I were not married at the time. We went to a meeting. We all signed that it was okay to evaluate her because if I'm going to give every student a test, I don't need parent permission. If I'm going to give Frank a test and none of the rest of you are going to take the test, I need parents' permission. So we signed and we said that it was okay to evaluate her. And about 3 weeks later, we went back for an identification meeting. And at that meeting, they told us that we believed that she had a speech impairment and that 3 days a week, she was going to leave the classroom to go work with a speech therapy assistant. And like I've worked with everybody in the room, Like I've been on IEP team meetings with the school psychologist, with the special ed teacher, with the general ed teacher, with the principal. I know the speech path. And so like there's like 148 things you can do wrong in an IEP. My goal for that meeting was to find all the things they'd done wrong, right? And it was a fun meeting for me because I knew everybody. It was jovial. One of the challenges when their mom and I split up was that I had a lot of sort of perceived power in the schools. And she didn't like that because she didn't feel she had equal access to the schools. So we're walking out of the meeting and she's in tears. And I'm like, oh crap. Like I was too familiar in that meeting. And I said to her, I want to apologize if I took over too much of that meeting and you didn't have a place in it. And she said, oh no, I'm really glad you did that. And I said, I'm confused. I'm not sure what emotions I'm observing right now. And she said, I am so sad because I never thought of my child as having a disability. And I'm like, speech? Like I'm blown away by this perspective. Now I'm completely desensitized. I've been in 1,000 IEP meetings. Like I was kind of happy that finally one of my kids was receiving the services that I've studied and worked so hard for. But like when we do research to look at equity and adequacy in special ed services and I get a giant data set for an entire state and all the kids that receive services, if I'm going to do some analysis of that data, the first thing I do is clean out all the data related to any kid that only receives speech services. It's delivered in a clinical model. We don't even really think about it like special education. So I was really blown away at this. I'm having an emotional reaction because my kid needs speech services for a year. I'm desensitized. I understand that I didn't have empathy in that situation, right? I use that story in training special ed teachers because parents' reaction to something that we're very familiar with might be different. And so I think a lot of those conversations are parents' reaction to how they think their kids might be treated. And let's face it, right? How many of us went to school with kids with disabilities that got made fun of a lot, right? The access to the community, social acceptance for people with disabilities hasn't always been the best. It may be a legitimate fear. Okay. Anybody else? Vicky's ready to go. It's okay. All right. Thank you so much for coming. Have a great night.